Hi everyone, Karen Portaleo here. I was recently invited to make a goblin cake for the Labyrinth Masquerade Ball at the Center for Puppetry Arts here in Atlanta. I started off with a really simple armature. It's just galvanized pipe and flanges. And I'm attaching a loop of aluminum wire, and I'm covering everything with foil tape, which is food safe. I've got a nice big piece of styrofoam, and I'm covering that with aluminum foil. I use foil inside a lot of my larger chocolate pieces because it's light, it's inexpensive, and it's easy to sculpt with, as well as being food safe. So I did a 3D sketch first to kind of get an idea of what I wanted the goblin to look like. I'm applying the chocolate directly to the surface of that foil and beginning to build the mass and sculpt the face. Now, unfortunately, it was an incredibly hot Atlanta summer day. Not only that, but the air conditioning was not working in the bakery. So this was making working with modeling chocolate just about impossible. You can see it melting off the bottom of this piece. And you can also see that the chocolate is a little bit shiny. That's the chocolate melting and the fats separating from the solids in the chocolate, creating an all-around miserable experience. So after struggling with this sticky, melty mess, I finally gave up and had the idea of moving into this recently abandoned room at the bakery. So I kind of took it over, and it was nice and cool in there. And that made a much more pleasant work environment. So I'm sculpting away here, and I'm trying to get a little bit of a smiling expression, which isn't in my original sketch, and I'm not sure if I really like it. Here I am checking an expression on my phone. I took a picture. I do that a lot if I have to create a specific expression. I'll make that expression with my own face and take a picture, and then I have a great reference. Now you can see that the chocolate is no longer falling and it's not shiny. This is the perfect temperature and consistency for chocolate. It's nice and cool in the room. The chocolate's not melting, it's holding its shape as I'm sculpting. It's not separating, it's not getting oily. It's just right. Now the thing that's not just right to me is this face. As I'm sculpting, I'm thinking, well, I don't love the face that I'm making, but I was a little bit under pressure because the chocolate melting and working in that hot room and then moving rooms had put me a little bit behind. So at this point, I'm sort of rushing and not quite creating the face I want to create. It's just about at this point that I had to leave the bakery to pick my daughter up from school anyway. And I told her that I was sculpting this face and I wasn't really happy with it. And she said, "Oh, Mama, I'm sure it's fine. Let me see a picture." And I showed her a picture, And her exact words were, "Oh, that's cheesy." She didn't like the smile, just like I wasn't really confident about the smile. And she said the eyes were a little too high. And you know what? Sometimes just getting someone else's opinion makes all the difference. I absolutely agreed with her. So as soon as we got back to the studio, as you can see, I'm tearing into that piece, moving the eyes, changing the shape of the face, not trying to make her smile. She doesn't have to be a cheerful goblin. So the illusion I'm trying to create here is that she's got one big tooth that has pierced through her upper lip and is poking into her cheek. That's reason enough not to smile. And yes, I'm doing that funny thing with my mouth that I always do, which is so much more exaggerated in a time lapse. I look like I'm chewing gum. And I can already tell I like this face so much more. And I don't know if you experience this, but I certainly do. Once I kind of get close to where it is I'm heading, everything becomes just a joy. It's so much fun and it goes so quickly. I guess that's what they call getting into the zone. So day 2, I'm getting to add a lot of the really lovely little details that make her face so beautifully creepy. Now you can see I've made a little indentation in her eye, and that just helps me to visualize where she'll be looking. I won't leave that in there when I'm painting because I want the surface of the eyeball to be nice and smooth. horn right in the middle of her forehead. Adding some wrinkles and some expression. And now I'm going to give her horns on the sides of her head too. And again, I'm filling those in with foil because there's no reason for those to be solid chocolate. Now you see how the horn is separating a little bit. That's because I'm attaching warm chocolate to cool chocolate. But I took a little piping bag with some melted white chocolate, just melted chocolate chips. And that makes a perfect adhesive. Adding some texture to the horns. And now I'm adding little hairs to her moles and her nostrils. These hairs are made of corn silk, which I guess is under the category of technically edible, but probably not delicious. I filled the cake with red velvet cake. I thought that would be kind of cool and gut-like when you cut it open. So I went 3 layers of cake, a Swiss buttercream, a thin layer of raspberry preserves, and then bubble tea straws. Now in the bottom layer, I did use a few wooden dowels just to be sure that it's strong. Then I had a foam core separator, bubble tea straws, 3 layers of cake, foam core separator, until the cake was as tall as I wanted it to be. Then I carved it into her little goblin body. And the last thing I did for the day was to cover the carved cake with a nice thick layer. I actually did 2 layers of ganache. This helps keep the moisture in, and it helps the carved cake hold its shape. So I showed up the next day so excited to get her dressed that I forgot to turn the camera on, and I apologize for that. But what we did was we rolled out some nice big sheets of fondant, and then we took texture mats and rolled those with a rolling pin right on top of the fondant that was already rolled out. Now, these texture mats are actually the lace mats that you use for making sugar lace. So you can see she's got kind of a burlap texture, which ends up looking like she's wearing thermal underwear, and a couple of other textures. I wanted her to have a lot of texture in her clothing. Texture holds color and makes the look a whole lot more dramatic. So now I'm adding a little character to her staff. And see, he's not happy either. As you can see, the arm is foil as well. That makes it light, and the lighter it is, the better it's going to travel. If that were made out of something like rice cereal treats or somehow cake that was supported, it would certainly fall or split. I don't trust rice cereal treats for things like this. I just use foil. And so here's my piping bag with the melted white chips. Takes a second for them to cool off, as you can see. But once they cool off, those fingers are there forever. And I'm going to go ahead and say goblins have only 3 fingers. That is a fact. At least this goblin. So I'm going to paint her with confectioner's glaze and powder color. So here's my palette. Now, these are specifically powder color and not petal dust. You cannot paint with confectioner's glaze and petal dust. Petal dust is it's food color that has been diluted with other additives, chalks and fillers and things, which make it nice and light and soft when you paint on your flowers. But when you add it to confectioner's glaze, all of those thinners disappear and there's very little color left. So you want a nice saturated color, and then you can control the intensity of the shade, but you want to be able to go as dark as you can. So start with pure powder food color, and luckily there's a lot of those on the market now. And now I'm just going to layer the colors. In some spots, I'm going to use less glaze and more thinner. The less glaze I'm using, of course, the less shine I'm going to get. And there's some places I just don't want shiny. So I can use the thinner or alcohol to paint with my colors. And you can see that I'm getting just as light as you might with a petal dust. But for me personally, I just feel like I have a lot more control painting it on with the thinner. And I can also layer it that way. Sometimes with dusts, the more you layer it, it starts to get muddy, and we don't want that, right? And by painting, I can be very precise about where I'm putting the color. And if I do want some areas shiny, which of course I do, like the eyes and the inside of the lips, then I just use more of the confectioner's glaze and less thinner. More glaze, of course, means more shine. The hair coming out of her little head wrap is the same stuff that I used for her moles and nasal hairs, and that is corn silk. I shucked the corn yesterday and let it dry a little overnight, and it gave it a nicer texture, and it also gave it a chance to turn more yellow. It's pretty green when you first shuck the corn, so I wanted it to turn a little yellow, and you could do it even sooner if you wanted it to be a little brown. And I didn't try it, but I bet you could even airbrush it to get some more color on it if you wanted to. So you can see I'm throwing all the colors at her face. A pale flesh like this has many different colors. If you look at somebody's face, you know there's greens and blues and yellows. So I've got out a pretty wide palette of colors. I've got a few different shades of pink. I've got reds, so many colors, browns, light washes of brown. So when you're painting a face, go ahead and experiment with a really broad palette and study other people's skin tones in the sunlight and look for all those different colors, so many different colors. Rubens, the painter Rubens, he was a master of this. If you look at his paintings, you can see a rainbow in that flesh. If you use the color with just alcohol or thinner and no glaze, you can put a nice thick layer on and let it sink into the crevices like I'm doing here. And then you can take a little alcohol on your cloth and wipe that color away from the surface. Then it gets down nice and deep into those grooves and crevices and kind of accentuates them. And I do pretty much the same thing with the airbrush. So you can see I'm putting a nice thick layer of color all over everything. I'm really accentuating some of the deeper recesses. That's the beauty of airbrush to me, is accentuating those wrinkles and recessed areas. But I'll put a nice layer over everything. And then I can wipe a damp cloth over the surface and the color stays in the crevices and really accentuates that texture. The last few minutes before delivery are always a flurry of activity. I'm just checking everything, making sure all the details are executed well, that I haven't forgotten a spot, that everything is just so. I mean, if you're like me, you always wish you had more time and you always think, oh, I could have done so much more, but when the time comes to deliver, you have to deliver. And the final detail is this lovely crystal ball. It's glowing. This was Jennifer's idea, and if you've seen Labyrinth, you know the crystal ball has significance. So I just loved it. And now she's ready for the Masquerade Ball. And what a spectacular Masquerade Ball it was. The costumes were unbelievable, so imaginative and well executed. And if all of that wasn't magical enough, I got to meet Jim Henson, Jim Henson's son, who also worked on the movie Labyrinth. I cut the cake, and she was delicious. And everybody stuffed themselves on ridiculously large slices of cake. And that, my dears, is the Goblin Cake. As always, thank you so much for watching.